All right, we're back here on Good Evening, and Christine has joined us in the studios for When Monet Meets Debussy, the time of the week where we get to talk about art, artists, and the so many various relationships, beautiful imagery, and of course, with our expert, learn a little something. How are you doing tonight?
I'm very excited for tonight's artwork that we're going to be discussing.
Ooh, well, I am excited to jump in as well. I mean, it is summer still, so I wonder if this has a kind of a summer feel to it?
I don't know if it has a summer feel. It has, back in the 80s, maybe 70s, people were really into the future.
Oh, okay.
So it's both retro and futurist.
Ooh, retro and futurist. Well, I'm ready to jump in, and you usually start off by a little description for our listeners.
Yeah, so I'll start off with that. You're standing in a garden inside a dimly lit space with dark tropical leaves covering the ground, sprawling around you, up to the corners of the room. And you look down at the greenery that surrounds you, and looking back up at you are small pink screens blooming from the garden. They're tiny television sets, each varying a little in size and angle, but none bigger than your face, all somewhat facing in your direction. They've been synchronized to play the same funky broadcasts. Together they chant.
This is a glimpse of a video landscape of tomorrow, when you will be able to switch to any TV station on the earth. And TV guides will be as fat as the Manhattan telephone book.
And with this manifesto, you hear the keys of a piano performance roll in a bluesy 60s dance beat. With the upbeat rock anthem, Mitch Ryder sings, "Devil with a blue dress, blue dress, blue dress," and a sequence of clips behind the staticky screens of analog TVs starts off with dancers moving in a synthesized, colorized space. But the images soon jump from familiar Western popular culture to Korean dancers, then to a wildly synthesized cellist. No, a surreal performance of a woman attempting to play a man like a cello, and also Richard Nixon's face heavily distorted, rippling like a static disruption occurred to the technical mechanisms that were holding the image on the screens together. From Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and chants by the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, to Nigerian dance performance and Japanese commercials. It's a stream of consciousness journey jumping from one culture to another, from the familiar to the strange, through manipulations of images, colors, and forms that have been cut and pasted onto each other like a plastic collage of cross-cultural TV images, performing from the blooming screens of an indoor garden.
That was quite the description, but I have to know, who are we talking about? Obviously, it's someone who utilizes a lot of pop culture and visual imagery, but who is this person?
Yeah, so we're talking about a Korean artist, Baek Nam-Jun, and his work titled TV Garden. It's an indoor installation work dating to 1974 through 1977. And the moving images shown on his garden TVs was also an earlier work of his titled Global Groove. Now, the work was shown in multiple venues, varying in size and location, but all executed under the same concept.
I can't believe this was in 1974. When you think about a TV garden, nowadays it's not difficult to imagine, kind of very small, even flower-shaped TVs. But when you're talking about 1974, I mean, televisions were gigantic back then.
Yeah, they were. And, it was quite unusual to have TVs in the gallery space. So even though this seems like something that we might see today in a gallery, it was very unusual for his time. Now, he decided to create a garden of TVs because he was, often inspired by Buddhism. And Baek seems to be tapping into this idea of interdependence here. So we have a tendency to want to separate what we believe to be natural, like the environment, from the artificial, like the world of technology. But more and more we, are coming to see that these two realms, they coexist and they do depend on each other. And there was a lot of fear back during his time that technology could bring something destructive. And so Baek had a more optimistic view of technology, and he is trying to express that here. He believed it to be an extension of the human realm, saying, quote, "Skin has become inadequate in interfacing with reality. Technology has become the body's new membrane of existence."
Wow, he really had some deep thoughts on technology and also kind of predicted how it was going to interface in our life. At the time, especially in the 70s, and there was a lot of worry about kind of like a nuclear holocaust or something like that. But he kind of saw the lighter side of it and the way that you can use technology to express yourself. And since then, I have noticed in other art exhibits, not necessarily his, but other artists utilizing television, even some like outdoor stuff, indoor stuff. He really was an inspiration to a lot of artists.
He was. He did start a new era. And speaking of predictions, he also basically predicted that we would be using mobile phones, like smartphones. He talks about it in detail, and this was like decades ago. He's like, we will use a communication device that's like an improved telephone device. And he talks about how we will be interacting with each other, developing social networks, things like that.
So, was he always an artist in the sense of, doing these large-scale sculptures and stuff?
That's a great question. He was actually trained in classical music, and he was introduced to art through a very unusual way, an avant-garde movement that was, blooming in Germany when he was studying music there. And he wanted to create a visual experience of the sounds that he was making, and also a new experience where audience would be involved in the process of sound making. And it's only later on that he does become interested in TV sets and became one of the first actual visual artists to work in the media arts, bringing in televisions into the gallery. And, he was one of the first video artists as well to actually use video as a medium to create visual art. And so Global Groove, which is the video shown in this installation, that was one of the seminal works in video art.
I just can't believe at the time that, first of all, television is almost as expensive as it is nowadays. It's not cheap back then. So it is kind of high-end art in the sense of a hefty price tag. But the stuff that he filmed, the stuff that he collaborated, and the videos that he cut, very interesting. If you and I recommend all our listeners go and look him up, but he really had some innovative ideas about culture.
He did. And, he was always pushing the boundaries of what can be seen as art. He was inspired by the avant-gardes, but I think he was also drawn to TVs because of their broader cultural significance at the time. So TVs brought a sort of democratization of culture because it gave far-reaching access to the world that they now had toward the language of popular culture. So at the time, pop culture was seen as lowbrow, which is why a lot of these pop artists like to bring such ideas into the gallery space to mix what was deemed low with what was considered high culture. So anyone, has access to a television and access to the culture that you might come across on TV. It doesn't require things like class or status, and you can watch it anywhere around the world. So pop culture really helped this process of globalization, making the world feel like a smaller place. And globalization also, helped, disseminate pop culture at the same time.
Well, that is really inspirational. And of course, it is the foundation of, I don't mean, who could have predicted what eventually would lead to, where nowadays it's such a mix of pop culture into our modern society and art that reflects that. And there's kind of almost like a big loop that goes on. But he was able to see the world through kind of this different lens. And that's something that I really appreciate. And just the fact that he was kind of well-traveled. You said he studied music in Germany. Obviously, he's Korean. He was able to kind of bring the world a little bit closer.
Exactly. And, that's the world that we see today. We're seeing the height of this trend with things like social media. The world seems closer. We can, see what other artists are doing in Africa, in countries we've never been able to travel to before. And the music, the literature in different areas of the world as well. I think the reason why this really spoke to Baek at the time, like you said, was because he was a nomadic artist. He traveled a lot. He was actually the 7th person in Korea to be able to get a passport. So passports were very rare at the time.
That's really interesting. He was the 7th person to get a passport.
Yes, that was.
What's funny is that even, actually up until the 80s, it was really hard to get. You'd get like travel permits or something, but he actually had a passport, which means that, he was able to spread his ideas freely and also take in a lot of ideas.
Exactly,
I'm actually curious where else he went to.
Yeah, well, he got to see a lot of the world. He went to high school in Hong Kong. He studied at a university in Japan. Then he went on to Germany, like we talked about. And finally, he met the artists there and moved to New York City to help start the Fluxus movement. Now, he, you could say he was ahead of his time, but he's a lot like the people today. He saw different cultures. He just had ability to access them. So he has a very different perspective that he's bringing into the world. And, he grew this sort of global mindset. And I really connected with him personally because I grew up as a sort of third culture kid. And that's even a little bit unusual today, but you're seeing more and more of this happening today with, air travel being so easy. So I think what he did back then really speaks to us today as well.
Well, it is really amazing. And the piece in particular that we're discussing is the tree garden. And it's one of those that I guess it still would be kind of, first, very cumbersome. It's a large installation. And I love the works that he does because it's merging space with something like video. And it's almost has a timeless aspect. And at the same time, commenting about nature and technology and how it works. That's what we're talking about tonight, nature and technology.
Yeah. And, like you said, like this idea of having televisions installed in a space, I think it was more for him, it wasn't just about technology. It was about what technology could bring into the conversation that we have as like culturally, as we interact with each other. And in particular, the video that he shows, Global Groove, addresses Baek's interest in globalization because he is referring to a theorist, Marshall McLuhan, who in the early 60s talks about something called the future global village. Now, this global village would connect everybody everywhere through technology, and he said that the world would enter a fourth era of electronics where people would be able to find and experience the same information through technological tools. Sounds a lot like the internet.
That does sound like the internet. And, it's funny that when you look at this and you imagine even nowadays, it looks so contemporary. I mean, like you said, it's kind of retro because all the televisions, of course, are from, the 70s. They're old, but at the same time, screens are screens. And it does look like a futurist kind of setting in that sense.
Yeah, you were still interacting with screens today. Screens are a big part of our life today, in fact. And, I also like how, he wasn't just talking about this really serious concept of the global village. But he makes it the global groove. He likes the groove. He's a musician. And so he said, quote, if we could compile a weekly TV festival made up of music and dance from every country and distributed it free of charge around the world through the proposed common video market. It would be a phenomenal effect on education and entertainment. So just this idea of having a festival of dances from around the world, it's a really fun, like humorous way that he is approaching this theory. And it's also helping us talk about a more serious and real concern that they had at the time on what technology would bring to us in the future.
And it's also very interesting that he was able to, this happened in the 70s. I believe he lived quite some time after that, and he was able to kind of see the rise of technology.
Yeah.
Almost seeing his predictions and what he thought come true, and kind of validate some of the choices that he made in his artwork, because he was really setting the world up to accept the way that we use technology nowadays.
Yeah. And one thing that I found really interesting was when the other artists or people in his life talked about him after, he passed away in 2006, I believe. They said that, he had a way of always seeing the bright side of things. So he had a very positive aspect to bring to all of this conversation. And I think the way that he uses art to talk about technology is interesting because he brings in humanity and beauty and also humor. And, this idea of a TV garden is very silly. Some even call it neo-Dadaist because it's so nonsensical. But having a garden of TVs and a global festival of grooves, so to speak, it can really start a conversation about something that is important to us. Screens do matter to us today, and it really gets us engaged with the topic.
Well, that is a really interesting way to get, I guess, the topic being about our kind of relationships with nature and technology, and something that, we kind of all deal with on a daily basis, given the fact that we do live in a city. We're a little bit one step removed from nature, yet we're always being affected by nature. I mean, even the typhoon that's coming, now is still going to affect us. And it's something that, he was really open to and really brought a nice way to introduce a conversation like that.
Yeah, it really does. And, technology isn't so detached from our lives, just as environment and nature isn't so detached from our lives. In fact, they go hand in hand, right?
Yeah.
And another thing that I found interesting was that McLuhan, he talks about this idea of a global theater. So with this era of technology, he said that people would no longer be consumers, but also become producers now because, they have access to different information and diversity of culture. And I think we start seeing that in Baek's work because he is able to, bring in something he saw in Japan, something he saw in Korea, really tap into his roots, but also his inspirations that he got from Germany and the U.S. And I think it's a lot easier for us today because we have the internet. We can start groups, start conversations, cross cultures. Yeah. And so we have this ability and also to, share what we're making through the internet as well. We have the ability to use the internet or other forms of technology as our stage and become our own producers. So I think Baek is really an inspiration for us to see that, we're not helpless to technology, but we can create and use it for bettering the world around us.
Yeah, and I'm curious if I guess what stage are we in nowadays? Is it like a postmodernism? Would you call it? I don't know.
Yeah, that's the idea of postmodernism. Yes, so I think with modernism, it was all about finding your own true voice and talking about your cultural context. But with postmodernism, cultural context is all jumbled up because we have all these cultures mashing into each other.
Yeah.
And now we have the sort of agency and the ability to be our own DJs of cultures. Wow. So we can mix in our cultures and create new worlds.
Well, he definitely helped usher in this era of, postmodernism. And I'm really glad that you're able to bring him to our attention. I hope that I get a chance to see some of his works in the future. I know that they're featured all around the world, so the chance is pretty good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on, and I guess we'll see you back here next week.
I'll see you next week.